Welcome back to XSOAR Engineer Training. This is part 6, Playbook Building Essentials. In this video, we'll be reviewing key playbook essentials that every XSOAR engineer needs to know, including integration versus automation versus built-in commands, inputs, outputs, context, and advanced task options. And with that, let's get to it. Let's start by creating our new playbook within XSOAR. We'll navigate over here to the Playbooks menu, and we'll click New Playbook. Call this XSOAR Engineer URL Alerts, and hit Save. Now, as we're building a custom playbook, we're basically presented with a blank slate, which we can build from. Now, on the left-hand side, as a default, the task library was popped out for me. I can close this out and get back to it just by popping it out here. Now the task library shows us the available automation scripts as well as integrations and their commands that we have available to us to help build our playbook. For example, we'll be using the Active Directory query integration here to retrieve user and manager information. If we pop this out, we can see we have the available commands from this integration, and to add it to our playbook, we can simply click Add and start adding in the inputs and outputs. In addition, from the task library, we have manual tasks, which allow us to copy manual tasks from other playbooks. So these are tasks that have to be completed by an analyst. They're not automated. And if we have a good manual task from another playbook, we can add it in here as well. Lastly, from the task library, we can click the Playbooks menu, and this allows us to add sub-playbooks into our parent playbook, a topic that we'll be covering as part of this series. Now, in the absence of the task library, you can also add tasks just by clicking this little half circle underneath each one, dragging and dropping, and it will default to creating a manual task that we can build from. The nice thing about using the half circle to create tasks is it automatically links this task to the one that we created it from. So it created it from the playbook triggered and just added the arrow to go to this new task. Now we can give this task a name. We'll call it Playbook Essentials. This is a standard task that is the default. Now standard tasks are either tasks that allow for manual action by an analyst, or more commonly will run an automation script or an integration command. Now we have a number of different task options here that you should be aware of, and we will be using these as part of building out our playbook. But we have conditional type tasks, which allow us to branch our playbook based on certain conditions. Data collection tasks, which allow us to ask either analysts or users for information and have our playbook respond accordingly, or even section headers, which can just be used to organize our playbook into different phases or sections. You may have a section header that has the triage, a section header for remediation, etc. Now, in lieu of adding tasks from the task library, we can change this standard task to run an automation or integration command simply by selecting the Choose Automation drop-down and selecting the automation command or integration command that we want to use. Now this list here is easy to search, but we want to highlight a couple key concepts. First of all, integration commands can be identified by their format. For example, if we type in AD-GET-USER, an integration command is all lowercase with dashes in between it. These are typically in the format of product, action, and then object, so Active Directory, get, user. Integration commands are used to reach out to integrated products like Active Directory or Cortex XDR and perform the action that that integration command is designed to do. Next, automation scripts can be identified by a title case format, and these are often used in playbooks to transform data, etc. For example, if we search for generate password, which is an automation script that we will be using, you can see that it's in a title case format. Another one may be base 64 decoding, which allows us to decode base 64. This is an automation script, and these can be found from the automations menu within XSOAR, which is useful to know. Lastly, we also have built-in commands. Now, built-in commands are commands that are in XSOAR and designed to work with XSOAR incidents, indicators, threat intelligence reports, and users. These can be identified by the camel case format. So for example, we have set incident, which is used to set incident fields, or set indicator, which is used to set indicator fields. These are built-in commands. They can also be identified by the built-in in the brackets after them, and again are used to manipulate XSOAR incidents or indicators, threat intelligence reports within XSOAR. So again, as XSOAR engineers, it's important to understand the format. We have built-in commands, which are the camel case. We have automation scripts, which are the title case. So generate password. Right? And then we have integration commands, which take the format of product, action, object, and these are all lowercase with the dashes. Now, a common question is, how do you know what you need to use? Well, if you reviewed the commands that are provided by the integrations you've already enabled, that's one way. You can see which commands are available and which you might use in our playbooks. In addition, you can review the XSOAR marketplace and the packs you have installed to see what integrations and automation scripts are part of that, and that does include a description. You can also review our task library. We'll get out of here for a second. Task library. Under the automation menu, we can look at commands associated with the integration, which also include a nice description of the command or automation. Lastly, when you do add a new command and you select the automation from the dropdown, we'll use the AD-GET-USER command. Right? You can always hover over the tooltip, which explains what this command or automation script does, so that you can decide whether or not it suits your use case and your playbook. As XSOAR engineers, definitely be aware of this. Definitely review the integrations you've enabled, their available commands, review the automations that are part of your XSOAR install or part of the marketplace packs. It's the best way to get familiar with what capabilities you have within the platform. Now for XSOAR engineers, there's one more thing we'd like to call out, and it relates to integration commands that you select from the dropdown. If we take a look at this command, and we'll use AD-GET-USER as our example, when we search for AD-GET-USER, you can see that we have two options available to us. So which one do we pick? To break it down, the command with the brackets, with the name of the integration within it, indicates to the playbook to use the AD-GET-USER command from the Active Directory Query v2 integration. The command AD-GET-USER without the brackets means that the playbook will attempt to run this command for any enabled integration that has that command. The most relevant example of how this works are for commands like domain, file, URL, or IP. These are common commands that are used to retrieve information from threat intel integrations for these types of indicators. For example, if we search for the IP command, scroll down through our list, the IP command returns enrichment information about an IP from our configured threat intelligence integrations. Now, if we wanted this information for all enabled integrations that have the command, we can select this one here without the brackets, which will execute the IP command across autofocus, VirusTotal, and the random threat intel integration that we're going to be using for our use case. If we only wanted the IP command to be run from the autofocus integration, we could select the one from autofocus. Let's take a look at how this works in practice. For example, let's select the IP command, the one without the brackets. We'll just type in an IP address, 8.8.8.8. We'll hit OK, and we can actually run this playbook from our playbook debugger. Let's give it a quick run, let it continue to process. If we take a look at our task here, take a look, we now have 3 results. It executed the IP command across autofocus. Scroll down, we can see that it executed it against VirusTotal and also our random threat intelligence integration. If we stop our debugger, give this a stop, and go back to our task, and this time choose just the IP command from autofocus. Okay, hit OK. Give it one more run. Now if we look at our results, we can see we only have the one result. We asked it to only run the command from the autofocus v2 integration, and it only retrieved the information about this IP from autofocus. If we take a look at our integrations page, we can see what this looks like. Pivot over to integrations. We filter down to enabled integrations by data enrichment and threat intel. If we review the autofocus v2 integration, we can see we have commands for domain, file, IP, URL, our random threat intel that we'll be using, same commands, and then virus total, again, has the domain, file, the IP command, and URL. So as XSOAR engineers, be aware of how this works. If you wanted to execute commands like IP across all integrations that have the command and are enabled, you can select the one without the brackets. If you want to target a specific integration, select the one that has that integration name within the brackets as well. Now for the rest of this series, we're going to not be using virus total or autofocus, so we're going to disable these integrations as we'll be using fake data for our alerts. And we're going to pivot back to our playbook where we'll stop the debugger and we'll talk about playbook inputs, outputs, and context. So for this, we're going to start our playbook by performing an AD get user lookup. So we'll give this a name, lookup user in Active Directory. Let's select the AD get user command, again picking the one in brackets to make sure it runs from that particular integration. And let's talk about playbook inputs, outputs, and then context in relation to playbooks. Automations and integrations in most cases require inputs to allow them to run and perform the action they're designed for. For example, for our AD get user command, you can see we have a number of inputs that are available to us in order to allow us to execute this command. Now for any of the inputs, for any automation or integration, you can hover over the tooltip on that input and it should give you information as to what this is expecting. Now we can hard code some of these. For example, we may want to look up james.bond at xsoar.local and we can have our playbook look that user up by email address. However, more likely, we're going to be wanting to dynamically pass information into this command, and we have a number of different options to do that. Remembering back to our video on mapping, we place the email address for the user from our alert in the source username field. And via the playbook editor, we can quickly pass this into this input to allow our playbook to execute based on that field, based on the incident that came in. We can click the blue curly brace here. And this gives us access to things like the incident fields under the incident details, as well as other options that we have available to us via the playbook editor. Now in this case, we can look at incident details, scroll down and try to find the field, or we can simply search for it. We'll search for source username. And we have access to just drop the source username as an input into this automation. Note the $ curly brace format here. This is how we can tell XSOAR to grab information from the context, which we'll discuss next, and put it as an input into this particular field. For now, we can close out here, and you can see how easy it is to add an input using the available data from things like our incident as inputs into our automation. Now, automation and integration commands will often return information to XSOAR and to our incident, which can then be used to drive the playbook along and take different action. This is done in the form of outputs. If we review the outputs for our AD get user command, we can see the information that this command will return to our incident in order for us to use it within our playbook. Now, our outputs are stored in what's known as the incident context. So to show you what we mean, let's run this command and we'll show you how it returns information to the context via our playbook debugger. To start, we can pop out our debugger panel. We can run this playbook using either a mock incident, which may not have our available data. So in order to make sure we actually get something back, let's pivot over to inputs and let's, using our playbook debugger, override the input for this just for testing. We'll ask it to look up james.bond at xsoar.local, as that's a user we know is available to us. We'll hit OK. And now we're ready to run this command. You can see over here on the right-hand side from our debugger panel, we have the incident object stored in context. It currently has no data because this is a mock incident. We could choose to run this from a different alert. So if we look at URL allowed, see that we now have access to the information from this particular incident. For now, we'll use the mock incident for testing. If we give this a run, you can see that it will look up the user in Active Directory, and we get some information returned into the incident context. If we take a look at the command and the outputs that were shown on the Outputs tab in our Playbook editor are basically returned under keys in what's known as context. Context is used to store the outputs of integration commands or automations, often so they can be used as inputs to further commands within our playbook. For example, if we stop this and we add a task underneath the lookup user in Active Directory, we'll use the print automation, in this case just printing data, and we'll call this print SAM account name. And this automation requires a value. It's mandatory, it needs something to print. So again, we can click the blue curly braces, and you can see that we have the outputs for our lookup user in Active Directory available to us from the Playbook editor. We didn't need to know where to get it. It's available because it is defined as an output for that task. We can click Active Directory.users SAM account name to get access to this output that was placed in context. We'll hit close and OK. Let's give this a run one more time to show you how this works. Okay, so it executes the lookup user in Active Directory, and then it prints the SAM account name for James Bond. It's doing this by grabbing the data from the Active Directory key here, users, and then SAM account name. As XSOAR engineers, it's important to understand this concept. So let's stop our debugger. We don't need our print command anymore, but to review, automations and integration commands take inputs, right, which can be passed in here. They produce outputs, right, which are defined on the Outputs tab. These outputs are stored in the context of the incident and can be used to be passed into further tasks in our playbooks. Now lastly, if you're using an automation or an integration command which does not have any outputs defined, that is possible. It means it might just return useful information to the war room, but doesn't actually return any outputs to context. Next, let's roll through some of the other options we have available to us via the Playbook editor for our tasks. First of all, the Mapping tab allows us to map outputs from our automation or integration to incident fields. We'll be covering this in the next video. Next, with integration and automation commands, there are a number of advanced options we want to make you aware of. First of all, the using parameter allows us to tell the Playbook to execute the command from a specific integration instance. In this case, if we have multiple instances from our Active Directory Query v2 integration, we can select using to only tell the Playbook to execute it from a specific instance. If we don't, it will execute the command across all instances. Next, for tasks that may error out or they're just flaky, we have the option to specify retries for the task to complete. So if this task were to fail, we can ask it to retry one more time, and you maybe back off 60 seconds between retries. This is useful for an integration where there might be network issues or it just fails randomly, and we want to make sure that it does succeed. Now, in the event a task fails and you do want the Playbook to proceed even though there was an error, you also have the option down here to tell the task whether or not to stop on error. This is important if the information from this task is not required for further tasks. You can have it continue without stopping on error. Next, we have the option to perform indicator extraction based on the results of this task. Now, by default, extraction and enrichment does not occur based on the results of the task, but should we wish indicators to be added to our incident and enriched through threat intelligence based on the results of this command, we can specify the indicator extraction mode for this specific task. Now, these are the same options we saw on our incident types in a previous video, but by default, it will use the system default, which is not to perform indicator extraction, so none, but we can perform inline extraction to ensure that that happens before the task completes and proceeds to the next one, useful if we need those indicators for the next task, or out of band, which will not block the task from completing and moving on, it'll happen at the same time. Next, should we want the results of this particular command to be highlighted into our war room, perhaps as a note, which signifies important information to the analyst, or even automatically added to our evidence board, we can select these tabs, these checkboxes as well. In this case, we may want the information about the user to be highlighted to our analysts, so we can mark it as a note. Lastly, from the advanced options, quiet mode. Quiet mode basically disables auto extract and enrichment, and it also prevents any entries from being written into the war room. We'll cover this as a part of a video in this series, but basically you have a couple options for quiet mode. You can use the Playbook default, which is set under the settings page here, advanced, and you can tune the entire Playbook to quiet mode, or you can turn it on or off based on the task itself. Lastly, we have the Details tab, which allows us to add in additional information to the analyst we'll be doing as part of our Playbook build-out, and the Timers tab, which allows us to start, stop, or pause timers. Again, another thing that we'll cover as part of this series. And with that, those are the essential Playbook items that we wanted you to know about. Let's do a quick review before we wrap this video. Now remember, when adding tasks via the Playbook editor, or even working from the XSOAR command line interface, the following formats indicate the type of automation or command being used. If it's the format of lowercase with dashes, this is typically the integration, the action it will perform, and the object it will perform against. Integration commands can be reviewed from the integrations via settings and integrations. Next, automation scripts, which are used to transform data and do formatting, etc., are title cased. So these can be reviewed from the automations menu within XSOAR. Lastly, the built-in commands, which are used within XSOAR to perform actions against incidents and indicators and users, etc. within the system, are camel cased. They also have the built-in brackets after them. Next, inputs are the arguments that we pass into our automation scripts or integration commands. Inputs can be passed from things like the incident data, fields, and labels, or even the outputs of previously executed tasks, XOR lists, or you can even hard code them. Next, tasks produce outputs, which are then stored in the incident context and can be used by downstream tasks in the playbook. Lastly, context. Context contains the outputs of those tasks which are executed in the playbook or from the command line interface, and the context is used to store those outputs so that they can be used as outputs in following tasks. Next, as XSOAR engineers, remember how integration commands work in playbooks. For example, if you select the command that has nothing in brackets after it, this means that the playbook will execute the command from all configured integration instances that have that command. Remember our example with the IT command or IP command, where it executed those across all the configured instances for autofocus and VirusTotal. Now when selecting the one that has the integration name in the brackets after it, it means the playbook will execute the command from all integration instances for that specific integration. For example, running the IP command from autofocus ran it only against the integration instance for autofocus. Lastly, let's highlight a few of the more useful advanced task options. First of all, the using parameter allows you to select the specific integration instance that you want to use to execute the integration command. You can specify auto extract on task results, which enables auto extraction and enrichment for those. This means that indicators will be extracted from those results, enriched through threat intelligence, and associated with the incident. Now the default is none, but you can specify inline or out of band depending on your use case. Next, the retry and retry interval allows you to retry an automation or an integration command that fails on error before it stops the playbook. This is useful for integrations that are hit or miss. Lastly, you have the option to mark task results as notes or evidence to highlight it in the war room or add it to the evidence board. And you can specify quiet mode on tasks or playbook. Now, quiet mode sets tasks to only create warning or error entries. And in addition, quiet mode disables auto extract and task inputs and outputs are not saved. However, as XSOAR engineers, do know that those outputs are still placed into context for use in further tasks. And with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the